The insults keep flying on Capitol Hill as Nancy Pelosi takes her war of words with Donald Trump to a whole new level.
The White House is just crying out for impeachment. That's why he flipped yesterday.
Reports say Pelosi told House Democrats this morning that Trump, quote, wants to be impeached so he can be exonerated by the Senate, and called his actions villainous to the Constitution of the United States. Her statements come in the wake of dueling press conferences yesterday where she said the president was engaged in a cover-up, and he said that unless Democrats end the congressional investigations into him and his organizations, he wouldn't work with them on infrastructure or, for that matter, anything else. And though the House Speaker says she's still hesitant to start the impeachment process, she introduced another I word into the equation.
What he is doing is an assault on the Constitution of the United States. I pray for the President of the United States. I wish that his family or his administration or his staff would have an intervention for the good of the country.
Of course, the Trump administration says Democrats are the ones who need an intervention themselves.
Nancy Pelosi's problem is that she's totally lost control of her party.
The president is actually putting the American people first. It's the Democrats that don't want to do anything.
Yikes, but it's not just Democrats coming after the president. Reports say his own former Secretary of State, that's Rex Tillerson, is criticizing the president's ability to effectively lead on the international stage. According to the Washington Post, Tillerson told lawmakers that during a 2017 discussion with Putin, that was at a G20 meeting in Germany, Putin seized every opportunity to push what he wanted. There was a discrepancy in preparation, and it created an unequal footing. Will this be a breaking point for Republicans in D.C.? Joining me are Michael Curry, former president of the Boston NAACP, now chair of the National NAACP Advocacy and Policy Committee. Michael, it's good to see you. Former state treasurer, then a Republican, and now an independent, but a Trump supporter, Joe Malone. Joe, it's good to see you as well. You know, starting with this Tillerson thing, it's not just another crazy Democrat. It's his own Secretary of State. He talked about his American value system, Tillerson's, which included things like freedom, democracy, human dignity. Does the president share that value system? Tillerson said no. I'll ask you what Chuck Todd asked on our show this morning from Meet the Press. Republicans at some point, do they want to sit there and have their only accomplishment be protecting Trump? Do they?
Well, first of all, I pray for you, Jim.
So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Is there anything worse than saying that about someone?
I thought it was appalling, frankly.
Wow.
We discussed that last night.
So with regard to the former Secretary of State, I think the Pompeo appointment was a major upgrade in that position. I think this is a guy who's bitter. He was publicly, hung out to dry. Trump didn't do it in a very polite way, and he's mad as hell at him now, and that's what he's got to say about it.
But isn't there somebody in the? I know you're a former Republican. But isn't there somebody in the Republican Party who says when a guy who he didn't sneak into the Secretary of State's office, Donald Trump appointed him Secretary of State, is saying Jared Kushner is essentially a rogue emissary, has no idea what he's doing, doesn't talk to anybody in the State Department, the president doesn't share his American, but on and on. Everything can't be dismissed as some disgruntled former employee or a Democrat, can it?
Anybody who's ever been in politics knows when you fire someone, you almost expect that there's going to be that disgruntled response. And a lot of people keep bad people on board because they're afraid of it. I give Trump credit. If someone's not doing the job, you show them the door. And again, I think Pompeo is doing a hell of a job compared to what his predecessor did.
So will the Republicans break at some point? I know you're not amongst them. But other than Mitt Romney saying he was troubled by the Mueller report, Representative Amash, it is rare to find a Republican even willing to criticize the president on a minor issue, much less a major one.
I think that they are unlikely to criticize him until, in their case, that he gets reelected. There is no doubt, and I talk to Republicans all the time, some of them even who are Trump voters, who will quietly tell you that they're disturbed by many of the things he does. In terms of Tillerson, Tillerson was billed as one of the brain trusts that he brought in, these super intelligent folks, highest IQ of any administration ever, and now he's dumb as a rock.
Dumb as a rock is what he tweeted.
It's troubling.
Trump.
It's not just one example of a disgruntled employee that you fired. It's a pattern of employees that are walking away and telling you that they're disturbed about this president.
But, I have to say, even though I'm more with you on this issue than Joe Malone, I am sick of this scorched earth thing in both directions. I want something good to happen. And it's hard to argue that the leader of the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, helps things with talking about an intervention from his family, the praying thing I was as offended by yesterday. And then here are just a couple of more samples from today alone from the Democratic Speaker.
He pulled a stunt, another temper tantrum. Again, he's a master of distraction.
Is this helpful? I assume it's strategic. How is this helpful?
You know, it's funny. I think of it as sort of an analogy to sports, right? You know, you can sit and watch a coach decide on a strategy for a team to win, right? And you can question it. And maybe if they win, then you say, okay, I was wrong. If they lose, you say, you know what, the coach was wrong. Ultimately, the Democrats are trying to figure out the right strategy to combat this president. And what they're choosing is to be equally as offensive and charge against him. Now, whether you question now whether that'll, support them in the next presidential cycle election, who knows? But I do think as Democrats, we want Democrats to be tougher in this debate.
But, there's tough and there's insulting, at least from my perspective. But, you said the right strategy. How about the right thing? I mean, let's talk about impeachment. I think they're different in many circumstances. I did an event last night with Preet Bharara in Lexington, the former, obviously, Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney. And I'll try to put in his words something that he said when I asked him about the impeachment thing. And it doesn't matter whether you're for or against impeachment. I'm talking about a woman, Nancy Pelosi, who said repeatedly that he's committed impeachable offenses. He said, again, I'm paraphrasing, imagine a local prosecutor says, let me pick an office, the treasurer of the Commonwealth today has committed the following 7 crimes. But you know what? I'm not going to indict him or her because it may help him or her get reelected next November, so we'll just let it stand. How's that different from, an indictment is an impeachment. Nancy Pelosi is essentially the lead prosecutor. How is that any different? We'd be appalled by that than what Nancy Pelosi is doing. If he's committed impeachable offenses, then he should be impeached. If not, not. No?
Yeah. Well, I think, yes. I think the challenge that they have is that they're trying to make a decision based on the wins in terms of the American public opinion. And I think they're waiting to say, okay, well, if we initiate an impeachment process and the American public is, by and large, against impeaching him, then we set ourselves up to lose the next presidential. I don't agree with that. Ultimately, I agree with people like Ayanna Pressley, Congressman Pressley, and others who say if enough is there in the Mueller report to show that that there was collusion and that this president has met the threshold for impeachable offenses, let's initiate the process and let it play out.
15 seconds on the same topic.
Yeah, I think everything is so politically charged down in Washington on both sides. It's like the Hatfields and the McCoys. And if anybody steps out of line and says, no, don't impeach, then you have this energy that says the base wants it, go get it. And again, it's on both sides of the aisle, but it's at its worst it's ever been.
Let's go from a big crisis to a small but horrible crisis. According to the Boston Globe, when a group of 37th graders from the Helen Davis Leadership Academy in Dorchester, all students of color, by the way, visited the Museum of Fine Arts last week, this is a quote, one museum staff member reportedly told the Academy students, no food, no drink, and no watermelon. The school's principal, Arturo Forrest, also told the Globe, quote, he had heard other reports of museum security singling out students, following them as they progressed through exhibits while leaving white students alone. It wasn't just staff. The Globe also reported one museum patron reportedly made a comment to a female student about paying attention in the MFA so she could avoid a career as a stripper, while another patron referred to a group of students as, quote, expletive-deleted black kids, according to Forrest. The museum later apologized, saying they're extremely troubled or committed to being a place where all people trust they feel safe, and they're investigating. You spoke to Makiba McCreary, who is a point person at the MFA, just earlier today.
Absolutely.
What are they saying now?
So Makiba reinforced the messages that they put out online and then her statements that she's put out in the media. That they want to look at this and figure out what they did wrong and what they contribute. I think they'll look closely at the security in this case, that similar to the experience that many of us of African-American descent and others of color experience, where people follow you because they think that you're going to steal or be disruptive. She's acknowledging that there's some work to do. One of the things that I said to her is it starts with diversity. Makiba being there is a huge step for the museum, because I grew up going to that museum and have fond memories. But we now need to move forward with even more diversity so that things like this don't
Whatever
happen.
they do, though, doesn't that feed the notion that we've discussed a million times here, the infamous poll where African Americans across the country voted, and I ran in the Globe Spotlight series, the least welcoming city in America? They're not going to hear, most people across this country, white, black, Latino, what the museum's doing in response. They're going to talk about racist taunts being directed at kids.
Yeah, well, one, this is the case. Anybody who pays attention to race knows that it's not just Boston. We tend to beat ourselves up.
Yeah, but they were number one on that list.
Boston absolutely deserves the rap it has, but the rest of the country has it as well. If you do a Google alert and you put in racism, you'll get it in Chicago and New York and Des Moines, Iowa, and other places as well. It happens, but we got to be responsive to it. Boston has a unique opportunity that when things like this happen, whether it's the Red Sox at a game or whether it's in a museum, if we respond appropriately, we can be a beacon for the rest of the country.
I say this with great care, by the way, because this is arguably the most important topic about which people should be most careful. But when the President of the United States talks about there are good people on both sides, refuses to condemn people who are clearly white supremacists, even though Huckabee Sanders says he does, it creates an environment in which this kind of conduct is at least more acceptable than it was. Is that not fair, Joe?
You know what? Clearly his language was sloppy. I think if you go back and read it in full, Trump's, if you read it in full context, it's not as bad as it's been made to sound. But secondly, as someone, my wife and I raised a black child in our family, and a neighbor had something missing from their yard, immediately got in this kid's face, blamed him for it. My blood was boiling. It took everything I could not to go over to the house and put my fist in his face. But the point is, for every bad person who's filled with hatred, there are so many more people who get it and understand that we're all God's children here, and that kind of nonsense is unacceptable.
But they don't make the headlines.
No, but the fact that it's getting this much attention is good, and that people are called out, whether it's an institution like the MFA. And as far as Boston, I think a lot of the reputation goes back to the busing situation, which was horrible. But I think anybody who's lived in Boston for a while realizes, as Mike says, it's a good city. You get some bad apples, but it's a good city.
But it wasn't just decades ago. We keep seeing it time after time.
And the only thing, and I appreciate, and I empathize with what Joe's son went through, but I will say this. I think we tend to like to believe that it's bad apples in a few, but nobody knows that, right? Other than African Americans who experience it in the supermarkets and by police departments and in housing situations. In fact, I don't know if it's 5% or 80% that walk around with these discriminatory behavior, attitudes, and whether it plays out in an overt way or a subtle way when they don't hire you or they don't rent the apartment to you. They're really egregious to me either way. And I think we tend to minimize it because we want to believe that people are better than that. I just don't. I don't know I subscribe to that.
We got to go. Joe, thank you for your thoughts.
Pleasure.
Michael,
Good to be
thank
with
you
you.
for yours. Appreciate it.